Welcome back, and thanks for joining me on another update on the worm bins. If you're new to joining me, I have 5 bins that I am currently running in my home. I have 2 regular totes, 2 vermibag totes, and 1 vermibag mini. I'm working right now with my regular tote, and with my regular totes, what I've been battling since I restarted them about a month and a half to 2 months ago is the water content in the bins. I live in South Jersey, and typically the issue I have with the regular totes, and the reason why I looked into getting vermibag totes, was that the regular totes tended to get very muddy. I originally had the 14 to 17 gallon size totes and then dropped down to the 10 because the less material I was composting at a time, the less I dealt with the extreme cases of muddiness. I still do have an issue with a lot of water being held in the castings themselves. I don't put holes at the bottom, so I don't have a 2-bin system, or do I collect any type of leachate or anything. These bins are pretty much dry at the bottom. All the moisture is within the castings themselves. So with that, I do try to keep my castings more on the drier side. I don't want them to feel like mud. I kind of want them to be somewhere between like a very wet brownie, wet cookie consistency, rather than being completely dry or super wet. So with these regular totes, this particular tote is a little wetter than its sister bin, but overall, I'm finding that the worms are moving well throughout. I don't have many travelers. I don't have tracks along the sides of the worms going anywhere. And the size of the worms, the colony itself, I'm finding cocoons as well. So that lets me know that the worms are pretty happy. So after sifting through, and I go in every week and turn over my castings. After sifting through the casting, didn't find a lot of food particles, so I'm just gonna feed this. And this week all the bins are getting a blended up squash, so I'm just gonna feed it and put my grit on it. I'm not gonna put any bubble wrap, and maybe next week I'll leave the lid off. Moving over to my second regular tote. Now, even though the bins stay in the room together on the same shelf, they get the same food, and I think they have the same amount of worms. This bin was drier than its counterpart. When you look at the top of it, you can see that it looks a lighter brown than the deep brown when it's wet, like the previous bin. So you could do everything the same and still have an issue, because technically the worms are different, so the environment is different. But with that, the castings here were slightly damper. When I went through this one, I found a little bit more food than the last one. But what I'm looking for when I do this is the presence of worms. If I haven't done a massive pocket feeding, I look for whether the worms are still traveling without and breaking, or traveling throughout and breaking down the cardboard. And I also look for chunks of food. One thing I don't like to do is have lots of food left over in my bin. And here I found a large mass of worms. I put food towards the top in the previous week, so I expected them to be at that end of the bin. And I always fluff the last area I fed last the next week. So this is just a glimpse of the worms in this particular bin. Again, I don't see any evidence of worm trails, and the material itself looks good. It is still more cardboard than castings in this bin. Since I didn't find a lot of food, I just will add some food this week, the same food that the other bin is getting. Add some food, add some grit. I am opting not to put the bubble wrap on top of these, as I am still battling the water levels in the bin. And once I feed it and add the grit, this is all set, and the update's finished for this one. So the vermibag totes are my preferred method of harvesting, but I'm opting to run the different systems just to see the differences that come about with the type of castings. In here, these were started about 4 to 6 weeks before the regular tote bins. And these tend to stay drier, so the edges will be a little bit more crispy because the material of the vermibag tote allows for the water to evaporate throughout all sides instead of just from the top as I have it with my regular totes. When sifting through this material, it is more castings than cardboard. So I definitely need to stay on top of fluffing it because the bottom can definitely turn muddy real fast at this stage. At this point, I think I'm about a month to 6 weeks away from harvesting this bin, and I'll have to check back on my calendar to see if this bin went faster or about the same. I usually harvest within 120 to 160 days, so I don't know how old this bin is anymore, and I'll have to check. Now with this bin, I did give it an apple in the previous feeding, and the worms, this is a bunch of worms that fell out of the apple, but the worms are getting into this particular apple. And apples can hang around, and they're a great food to feed your bin if you are going away and you're not sure if you'll be able to feed your bin in the next 7 days. They do hang around for about 2 to 3 weeks. I'm just going to replace this apple, and since the apple is really the only food that I see in here, I am going to give it a normal size feeding in the other side of the bin. I like for the worms to travel all through this bin. So I'm just going to make a spot here and feed this bin. And these always get the bubble wrap because they dry out so quickly from the edges. Moving on to the fourth bin, which is the sister vermibag tote. Upon initial inspection, this bin is also drier than its sister bin, but the castings in both the totes are of a great consistency. They are more castings than cardboard, and the worms in the bins are looking really good. I have quite a few cocoons I'm finding in here, so I know they're getting along fine. And I am focusing on making sure I pull the material all the way up from the bottom. With this bin, I did have about 5, I think it might have been 5 apple halves that I put in here, and the apples are taking some time to break down as they normally do. So I found about 4 apples in here, and because there were so many apple halves in this end of the bin, I did give it a bit of a smaller feeding. It does look like a lot because the squash is blended up, but it does decompose very fast, so the worms will really be still feasting on the halves of the apples that are in the bin. So at this time, I'm projecting to be harvesting this probably by the beginning of May at the latest, but these definitely are going to be ready for a harvest. And when I harvest this bin, I'm going to also harvest the vermibag mini. I want to do maybe 2 to 3 harvests a year. I don't want to be harvesting the minis, then the totes, then the vermibag totes. I'm trying to get on an even schedule with everything. So that's all that I'm going to be putting as far as food in here. It's not as much as the other ones at all. It's going to get its bubble wrap, and then it is going to be updated for the week. My fifth and last bin is the vermibag mini. Now with the mini, since it is a flow-through system, I'm not fluffing all of the material. Really, I have to gauge the health of the bin by the top of the material. And with this one, even though I put a piece of bubble wrap over the top, the edges always are super crispy. This is one of the worms I found in there, and it is kind of chunky, and it's a good size. So again, everything's looking good in the bin. But since the material did drop quite a bit, I am going to turn the material over, and this is a nice chunk of a worm ball to the side here. So this is a good gauge of what's going on in my bin. And towards the top, I have a ton of worms, which doesn't always come through on the camera. But my intentions with this one, since there's more of a surface area for the water to evaporate from the sides, I'm going to bring this in, turn it over, and spray this part of the bin because it is a bit crunchier than I prefer. But I also want to add to the level in the bin. So I will be spraying this twice because I want it to stay moistened. And again, this is another glimpse of what's going on. That whole roll that came over is just filled with worms. But this is what the worm bin towards the top looks like for me, just worms galore. But I do want to focus on adding and raising the content level, but also not losing too much moisture to the sides or into the cardboard. So I'm definitely going to thoroughly wet this down, give it a nice size feeding because there was very few food particles that I felt when I dug my hand down to the side. And then once I have given it the food and the grit, then all my bags have been updated for the week and they're all looking good, looking healthy, no major concerns. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of this episode. I do hope you enjoyed the content. As always, thanks for watching. And you can always go through the library of worm videos to watch how I started these bins.